My name is Luke Marushka, and I'm a sophomore at Bennett Academy. I want to thank you, Mr. Monahan, for taking time out of your day to do this interview with me. Would you please provide your name and some of your background information about your education and career?
Certainly. My name is Ken Monahan. I went to Carmel High School in Mundelein. I went to the University of Chicago undergraduate, where I have degrees in economics and statistics. I then worked on the exchange floors in Chicago for a period of time. Then I was hired away by a bank in New York to work in the equity derivatives trading group. This business was acquired by Deutsche Bank, where I went in 1998. I eventually ran the equity derivatives trading group of Deutsche Bank from, I guess, 2002 to 2004. During that point, I helped start an options exchange, which turned into a very lucrative opportunity for the bank. So the bank decided to get into that kind of business a lot. So I moved to London. In London, I was the global head of business development for the equities business of Deutsche. So every time that we started a business or launched a new product or entered a new region, I was responsible for organizing our effort in that regard. During the global financial crisis, I took a sabbatical so that I could watch the crisis unfold. I resigned from Deutsche Bank in 2009 and set up my own consultancy to advise firms on how to manage the after effects of the global financial crisis. I ran that consultancy until I folded it into a larger consultancy called Greenwich Associates in 2018. And mystically, I now find myself as chief of staff to Congressman Peter Meyer, who asked me to join his organization in November of this year, or I'm sorry, November of 2020.
Now, I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about business ethics and how ethics have helped you answer questions or make decisions as a business leader.
By all means.
Do you have a set of ethical principles that you use when faced with difficult questions or situations in your career?
That's a good question. Do I have a set of ethical principles? Well, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because when you say that, what do you mean by that? So I would say, well, look, I was born and raised a Catholic, right? And so I have, a lifetime of social conditioning within Catholic social teachings and Catholic morals and ethics. I went to the University of Chicago where, we studied this, I think, in greater depth, although I'm not a particular theologian. The other thing is that, the nature of the work that I've done. So I guess it's a good question. So I'd say the very first thing is that, my ethical views of the world are informed by, Catholic social teaching, right? Then, however, I was sort of put into a number of environments in which you cannot necessarily hold your counterparties to account, right? Let me put it this way, a lot of ethics or this kind of thing, it turns on enforceability, right? Where let's say, here we are, we're both Catholics. If we sin against God, at Judgment Day, he's like, all right, you're on your way to hell. Right. If you've breached all these ethics rules, that's it, you're done. Or, hey, you've done some great work here with regard to your ethical behavior. Hey, all eternity of closest to God for you, right? Meanwhile, here on earth, right, there are a lot of environments in which it's not so clear, right, that you're going to be rewarded or punished for whatever you happen to do, right? Also, there are a lot of, the other nice thing about God is that he's omniscient, right? So you're always detected in anything that you've done that's unethical, right? And the other thing is that it's, a lot of things are very clear, right? Don't murder people, right? All right, that's a pretty, in the course of my business career, I'm not going to run into too many issues there, right? Then there are things where it's not necessarily clear, what the rules are. Right. And this is where ethics gets really, really tricky. Right. For example, I worked in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, the Bank Control Act is 64 pages long. Right. That's it. Right. And a lot of stuff is left open to interpretation. Right. And also the government there doesn't necessarily want to clarify what actually constitutes ethical behavior or not, because they basically want the ability to punish you, and sort of have something to hold over your head. Right. So in circumstances of ambiguity like that, to the extent that it's possible to sort of rely on, Catholic social teaching, that's what you would do. In circumstances where it's not, usually the way that I would think about it is, okay, what would people I'm dealing with learn about me by the way in which I did this thing or performed in this way and how would they interpret that? Let's say that I were to generalize, they were to generalize that and think like, Monahan has acted in this particular way under these circumstances. Would he likely do this again? So like, this is kind of a Kantian categorical imperative type thing. Or have you studied that, or is that like
slightly?
Yeah, so I mean, the categorical imperative is basically a rule whereby you should conduct your life such that every individual action that you've taken could be generalized into a universal rule, right? So if it's wrong to do in one circumstance, it's wrong to do in all circumstances, right? That like the moral value of a particular weight of a particular action is not contingent on the specific circumstances in which it's performed, right? Now, of course, like this is a really hard way to live one's life, right? Like. However, it's a good psychological framing for when you're making decisions, right? And that like the people who you're interacting with at the time that you're making the ethical decision will make interpretations about your character and how you'll perform and act in other ways later on. So let's say you and a partner are dealing with a third party, right? And you have the opportunity to sort of behave in sort of a sort of sailing close to the wind ethically manner with regard to this third party. Well, your partner might watch you sail close to the wind ethically with regard to this third party and think, geez, like what's going to happen when I'm the third party, right? Like I'm not always going to be partners with this guy. Like, and that's the thing. It's just as important it's important to treat the person on the other side of the table with you, right, with exactly the same kind of ethics. And this is also sort of a do unto others as you would have them, type principle. But in a lot of cases, when it's not totally clear, like what exactly the ethical thing to do is, thinking like, the use of the categorical imperative in those instances is often quite helpful. So I guess I would say that, it's, the thing to get away from is utilitarianism, right? Like the utilitarian thing, like, oh, greatest good to greatest number. Well, and I might slightly weight myself a bit greater in this utilitarian calculus. Right, like that's generally not something to do because the thing is you can net what the utilitarianism, assumes a fixed benefit in any individual, at any individual point of the decision making, but it doesn't necessarily factor in the fact that like your life is a multi-turn game, right? That like, you might be optimizing from a utilitarian perspective over the next 6-month span, but you might be damaging, yourself over the next year or 2 years. And so like, it's very hard to sort of use utilitarian, calculations in this regard. Right.
Now,
this is kind of a long one.
No, you're fine. So going off of that, do you recall any like a situation where you had to apply your like moral codes or like laws into a situation?
I mean, almost always. I mean, it's tricky. I mean, the things that always stand out are the clearest ones, right? Like the thing where like, oh, that time the guy asked if I, wanted a bribe and I said no, right? Or the time the guy asked me, hey, listen, it's going to take you 2 years to get this license unless you pay my consultancy $750,000, in which case you could probably get it in 3 months. Do you think you could, in this business, you're going to make $10 million a year. So obviously it's a very, this is again, an obvious instance where you would say, well, no, I will not do that.
Right. There you go.
I guess the instances where, like when I worked in the Middle East, there were a lot of circumstances where people like unethical behavior had become sort of accepted practice, right? Where, I'm thinking in particular in Saudi Arabia, right? In Saudi Arabia, foreign investment into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was illegal, right? But it was very common for people to use a structure called a nominee, right? Where you would nominate a Saudi, right? And he would invest, like you'd give him the money and then he would invest in his name and he would keep a little percent of the profits, right? This is, of course, absolutely, but extremely common. Right. And so we would be approached by people all the time asking like, oh, would you like to do this nominee structure? And like, there was a debate in our business as to whether or not we should do this since everyone else was doing it. We would put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage if we were to not do it. And I said, we should absolutely not do this. Right. Okay. Because what we're telegraphing to everyone in the industry is that we'll take shortcuts.
Right.
Okay. And like what that tells them more importantly is that like, one, they can shake us down. Right. And two, that we're not staying.
Right.
If you convey to people that you're not serious and that you're not staying, that you're not going to be around for like, the later turns of the game, right? Like they'll remember that, and they will like put a knife in you the first minute they can, because like the minute you sort of say, hey, I'm not going to treat other people ethically, or I'm going to not comply with the rules, right? Well, they don't know, like, well, if you say you're not going to comply with the law, well, how do I know that you're not going to comply with our informal standards as well, right? Like you're establishing a pattern of non-compliance that
The reputation built like that.
That's right. Like, like establishing, this is a thing that people don't understand. Like, it's funny. Whenever people would show up in our office in Dubai, the first thing I would tell them, particularly Americans, is I would always say, like, look, the fact is that, like, in the way that fish don't have a word for water, Americans don't have a word for the rule of law, right? Like, Americans are often sort of exempted from having to make a lot of ethical decisions because the rule of law is effective here, right? If you cross someone, they can sue you. And when you go to court, largely what's going, the decision of the judge is going to be made in accordance with the law and the facts of the case. Whereas if you go to court in Dubai, like what your last name happens to be is going to be way more important than what the facts of the case are. And if you are not from Dubai, right, and you're filing a case, like you're guaranteed to lose.
Right.
So there, establishing a reputation for honesty and credibility is extremely important. Right. Like, and that's why I sort of like refer to this sort of categorical imperative type thing where, people are always trying to figure out, like, all right, what's this guy going to do under certain circumstances? Because they know they can't enforce any agreements you sign with them.
Now, do you think that any particular business question, decision, or situation represents a difficult ethical issue?
What do you mean?
So based on what you explained previously with your, like, I guess, moral codes, like set of laws, could you form like a particular business question where similar to what you said before, actually, where you're saying that you have to decide whether to choose the right path or the quick but wrong path? Could you form would you consider that a good, I guess, would that be a hard and difficult ethical issue to choose between? Or would it be simple?
I mean, I'm trying to think of I guess, like, because so much of this stuff is like really deeply ingrained in me, I'm trying to think of a circumstance in which.
What would be a hard circumstance would you choose between?
I'm trying to think of a circumstance in which, like,
This is a tough one.
That's a hard one.
Well, we can skip on that and move on.
I'll tell you, like, in the universe, I'm trying to think of like maybe like decisions I've made I regretted, where I was like, was that the right thing to have done? The thing I could think of is this. So there was a period of time in my career where I was running a trading desk, right? And like a trading desk is sort of, you're basically betting against, right, other groups, in equity derivatives markets, right? And so, like, if I bought something, someone else would have to sell that thing to me, and in certain catastrophic cases, right, like the other person might lose more money than they actually possessed and would go bankrupt, right? So, and this was also true of me, right? Like if I lost enough money, my boss would fire me, right? So all of us are in this sort of competitive environment, and also it's a very elite circle, right? There at this point in my career, there were maybe 250 people in the entire country that were playing the game at the level that I was playing it at. And one day there was a counterparty that my company, like, he was on the other side of some trades of mine, and he went bankrupt, right? Like I was, if the day closed and I did not let him out of some of the trades he had done with me, he would have to close his company that day and, go home and, take his kids out of school, sell his house, right? Like I would basically destroy this particular person's business entirely. And I chose to destroy it. Now I felt like, well, look, if this guy couldn't afford to take these losses, why was he making these bets? It's not the responsibility of the shareholders of Deutsche to absorb the losses of this guy, right? And I don't, like, considering the shareholders of Deutsche would never have known, right? The amount of money that was involved to the organization that I worked for was, it would have been painful for me to absorb his losses, right? But I would not have been fired, right? It was the end of the game for him. It would not have been the end of the game for me. The game would have gone on. So I've debated whether or not, and this is kind of a utilitarian argument, right? Like, from a strict sort of ethical point of view, I think I did the right thing, right? Like, these people hired me. I was their agent, right? I was playing this game, right? Like there were no fools in this game. This guy just made some mistakes, right? But like from an ethical position, like it still tugs my conscience a little bit that I did that, and again, it also sent a message to everyone else, like, hey, Monahan means it, right? Like, yeah, like, if you're on the other side of Monahan and, and the thing for me, like, look, I mean, I never expected, nor did I really receive mercy from other people that often. So, I kind of, that's a decision that weighs on me to this day. I made it 20 years ago.
Right. Okay. Well, do you have any advice that you could provide for me as I think about ethical issues that I may face one day in my career?
Yeah, I think the way that you're framing these questions, right? Like that you should have a framework and a set of principles before you get in. Because if you don't, right, if you just show up there, the utilitarian transactional nature of most business, right, like will very quickly lead you astray, right? Like, and the other thing to remember is that, like, and this is again where like a religious grounding is very helpful because it gives you perspective, right? Like, if your main objective is to be a rationally calculating profit at maximizing, utilitarian, you're going to approach business with one. It's funny actually. Like, I remember it being in high school or maybe no college. It was like my second year in college, and I was meeting with a bunch of friends from my Catholic high school. And I remember one of them saying, "Listen, Ken, I can't believe you're studying economics. This economics is such a ridiculous thing." And I was like, "What are you talking about? It's a study of human behavior. It takes into consideration, all of human preferences, all these different things. It's genius." And she said to me, "Listen, Ken, you're wrong, because economics is not to take into consideration the fact that human beings have an immortal soul." And I remember thinking, like, that's ridiculous. Like, why would you, like, that has nothing to do with like the allocation of scarce resources on Earth. But as time has gone on, as I've gotten older, I think she was onto something there. Like as far as the actual decision making and what's optimal, right? I think taking into consideration that like you have to live with yourself, right? And at the end of the day, like you're subject to judgment, by an omniscient being. Like, I mean, it is something that should be taken into consideration. So I'd say that, like, look, you have to establish these principles for yourself, right? Like, what for you conducts a worthy life or constitutes the conduct of a worthy life, right? And then carry that with you into your business life. You should not begin with, okay, what is an ethical set of principles that will produce a meritorious business life? Because I can tell you for a fact, right, that a lot of people that I know are straight criminals are also absolutely spectacularly successful business people who will never be caught, right? And so, look, I mean, how they conduct their lives, that's up to them. But like, you're on Earth, like many people get away with extremely unethical things in the commercial world, and it is not designed to punish them.
Well, on that note, once again, thank you for your time, Mr. Monahan. This has been very helpful. I learned a lot actually from this. Thank you so much. It was really helpful.
My pleasure.